Welcome to lesson 9, the age of Alexander. So we're going to talk about Diogenes the Cynic, who was this strange philosopher who liked to go around acting like a dog. And, you know, you think Socrates was a gadfly. This guy is definitely a gadfly. And then we're going to talk about Alexander the Great. But just as a flyover, we have 3 authors tonight. So we have the life of Diogenes. We have Diogenes about Alexander the Great. And then we have a third author called Plutarch writing on Alexander the Great. Of all 3 of these authors, only one of them is considered a great author. And only one of these 3 readings is taken from a book that's considered a great book. I'd like to see if anyone can figure out who it is and then give me a reason why it makes you think that. Do you notice any difference between Plutarch's text and language and the effect of the text, and that sets it apart from the other 2 texts? Or does it seem like equally great in its language and in its quality of thought? One of the things that I'm hoping that will develop is a sense of taste. So like if you're good at analyzing paintings, what's a valuable work, what's a not so valuable work, who's a major painter, who's a minor painter, could walk into a room and go, that one, and that one, what's called a good eye. So I'm hoping that we develop that same kind of sense, that you develop what's called good taste. But we will talk when we talk about the life of Alexander by Plutarch, cultural fusion, I will give you my opinion on why it's great and the other ones are less great and are just good or very good. But there's a difference, like if you had a burning building, a burning library, and you could only carry one of these 3 authors out, you'd carry Plutarch, right? And I think that's what we call being in the canon, C-A-N-O-N, being part of the pantheon or hall of fame, if you will, of these writers. Let's jump in with Diogenes. I assume that you guys are underlining, and you might have found a line or 2 to underline about Diogenes. Is that right? Yeah. The first one I actually underlined, he called festivals and parades spectacles for morons, and politicians lackeys of the mob. Lackeys are people who just do whatever anyone else says. He used to say when he saw pilots, physicians, and philosophers at their work, he regarded man as the wisest of animals. But when he saw prophets, dream interpreters, and those who listened to them, or those puffed up with fame or wealth, he found no creature more foolish than man. This reminds me a little bit of last night where Aristotle said man is either the best or the worst. So Diogenes, using different examples, kind of seems the same. All right, so what else? Did anyone think that anything Diogenes did was sort of eccentric? A philosopher said that motion did not exist, and then Diogenes refuted him by standing up and walking around. Right. He would go into public and start babbling. When he talked on serious matters, like no one paid attention. So then he went into public and he just started babbling, and then people would pay attention. People gathered around. He reproached them for flocking eagerly to hear nonsense, but dawdling carelessly when he discussed important things. Yeah, he's carrying a bright light in the middle, broad daylight, pointing it around. And they're like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm looking for human beings." And they're like, "What are we, chopped liver?" And he's like, "Yeah, you're basically chopped liver." He said that people exerted themselves to outdo one another when exercising at the gym, but made no effort when it came to strengthening character. He marveled that scholars investigated Odysseus's failings, but not their own. He wondered why musicians tuned their harps, but left their souls out of tune. There's one thing I liked where he said, Plato was saying, if you had just been nice to this tyrant, you wouldn't have to be washing lettuce. Diogenes said, well, if you'd been willing to wash lettuce, you wouldn't have had to make nice to this tyrant. He said good men he called images of the gods, which goes to that godlike nature of man that a lot of these philosophers believed in. Asked where he came from, Diogenes replied, I'm a citizen of the world. That becomes a very important idea in Rome, in this idea of a global citizenship. And it's actually important today in places like Davos and Switzerland among the international business community. This idea of being a citizen of the world is big now. And the time we're in is globalization. That idea comes from Diogenes. He gets credit with being the first one to say it. Another idea that I think he's probably the earliest to say, Well, maybe Socrates beat him to it, but Diogenes said that he would not call death an evil because the dead remain unaware of anything, including death. So Diogenes didn't place a lot of emphasis on the value of custom. Once, as Diogenes lay in the sun, Philip's son Alexander came to him and said, "Behold, Alexander, the great king." And then what did Diogenes reply? Do you think that Alexander thought maybe he envied Diogenes and thought that Diogenes actually had more freedom than Alexander had? I think Alexander may have perceived that Diogenes actually had more power. Here's this man who's probably the poorest person in all of Athens, poorer than a slave, has less than anybody because he refuses to own anything. He throws away his cup when he realizes he can drink out of his hands. He has literally nothing. He sleeps in his clothes. Even the slaves are better off. And then there's the most powerful man on the planet, Alexander. And the two of them meet. And the most powerful man on the planet says, "I'll give you anything, just say." And Diogenes says, "Just move a couple inches to the left." That to me is a total demonstration of power. Like in a way, it's not like a middle finger to Alexander, but it's saying, "There's nothing you can do for me, really. I'm complete and I'm perfect on my own, thank you. What can you do for me? That you do me move a couple inches." So I think that Alexander was like, wow, like I thought I was super powerful, but here's this person who has nothing, who actually has, true power because he's master over himself. I am master over everybody else in the world, but I'm not master over Diogenes. He's master of himself. So I merely rule over everything outside myself, but Diogenes rules over everything within himself. With that, I hate to say goodbye to Diogenes because he's so interesting. I would just say he's the originator of what we now call the counterculture, which in the United States came out in the 1950s. First, there was these people called the beatniks, and they wore berets, and they would sit in coffee houses and cafes and listen to jazz. And instead of clapping their hands, they would snap. And then they became the hippies in the 60s, and they grew their hair super long, and they did drugs, and they would dance naked, kind of like Diogenes in the middle of Central Park. And then that became this girl with like green hair and like a nose ring, but they don't really have it on the inside. And the inside, they're just like total conformists and everything else. And I just want to point out that Diogenes, like anybody, can be used and abused and misused as well. The copies are never as good as the original, is what I'd say. And a lot of these people rebel not for the same reasons he did, but just kind of to shock responsible normal people. All right, so let's talk about Alexander. He brought Greek religion, Greek culture, and Greek values all the way from Italy to India. Now, if you look at a map, from Italy to India is a large stretch of population, right? And made it kind of one culture. Before that, every tribe had its own language. Every tribe had its own money and its own religion and its own god. And that actually is what happened in Africa. And then even in the 1960s, there were 100,000 different languages in Africa. Every village had its own language, because each tribe didn't acknowledge anything outside that tribe. And so the idea of building nations in Africa after the imperial powers left and gave their colonies back to the people was very difficult for these people because they had no larger identity than the tribe. So Alexander gave people a larger identity than their tribe. And it's what Diogenes said, being a citizen of the world. So it's really through Alexander that's making that to be possible for the first time in history, and would be continued today. Today, there's one world culture. Disney is watched everywhere, or whatever it is. So we kind of all are in the same page now. And really, Alexander begins that process. And he made a city after himself called Alexandria, where there was the biggest library in the world. And they collected books from all over the world. And that's where most of these works that are survived were kept in this library of Alexandria. Like, let's say it was a fortress or a military base. He'd say, well, it doesn't need to be that anymore. We brought peace to this part of the world. Let's make it a library. Let's make it a university. Let's make it a school. So it's called turning your swords into plowshares, is a phrase from the Hebrew Bible, which just means turning implements or turning tools of war into tools for peace. And Alexander did that in a big way. Let's talk about how he took power and how he won. And I'm interested in your response to this history, because as I was reading it, I'm like, it's not that it's boring, but it's just not, I didn't feel that it was as good as the stuff we'd read before. And I was finding fewer deep thoughts. But then I thought, well, there's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of conflict. Maybe it's interesting. So I'm interested in, what Jonathan would say. Tell me your reactions. A bit romantic, you're questioning whether it's true, or you're saying it was interesting. So let's talk about the Phoenicians and their strategy and their technology and their imagination, because that's going to come up again when we talk about Hannibal crossing the Alps. When the Carthaginians crossed the Alps with their elephants, that was the Phoenicians. Because the Phoenicians went and settled Carthage, and that became the big enemy of Rome. So the Phoenicians were able to do some really crazy stuff that kept them fighting Rome for a long time. So let's talk about, the part where they did the sand? They made shields of bronze and iron, filled them with sand, lit a strong fire under them, and heated them until the sand glowed red hot. Then, with the help of a certain contraption, they tossed the heated sand onto the boldest of the enemy fighters. So they didn't just toss it anywhere, they pick out who the boldest fighter is. And it caused agony for those on whom the sand fell, because the sand trickled down inside their breastplates and their underwear, searing their flesh with its great heat, and with no relief at all from the horrible thing that happened, the awful thing that happened to them. They screamed, no one could help them. Before they died, the pain drove them insane, drove them mad. And what else did the Phoenicians do? They sewed up skins and hides, folded double and stuffed with seaweed, and the soft and yielding material of the seaweed reduced the boulder's impact. Alexander's throwing these huge boulders at them, and to cushion the impact, they're putting up seaweed to cushion it. And like these guys are pretty smart, these Phoenicians. You almost think they kind of didn't deserve to lose, but they did lose. And why did they lose? And it seemed to me why everybody else lost against Alexander. Darius was so courageous. What happened? He ran away. And this goes to the importance of what we call morale or confidence. Once it gets in your head that it's very easy when you've seen people die right and left, you're like, well, should I stay? Why don't I just turn and run away and then I'll live? So, but I did notice the author seems to kind of imply that the Western people have more courage than the Eastern peoples they're fighting. So Alexander never is afraid, but Darius, the king of Persia, gets afraid. The Phoenicians get afraid. I think the Indians get afraid. Everyone gets afraid at some point except Alexander. And that goes to one of my questions, the writing prompts for tonight, is about the role of courage and cowardice in this story of Alexander the Great and the importance of that. Whether it actually happened that way or not, we don't know, but this is the earliest account by far of Alexander's conquests, which still survives. There were other histories, but they're now lost. So this is the first clue we have to reconstructing Alexander's career. One thing I noticed is that a lot of times they had Alexander taking the lead and being individual in this massive army. For instance, Alexander took the best of his cavalry and rode straight for Darius. It's almost like two knights jousting in medieval times in King Arthur. There's a kind of one-on-one quality to a lot of these. Alexander crosses over on a gangplank onto the wall by himself. He jumps down on the ladder and fights all these people. It's almost like a lion running amok. Oh my God. And they freaked out, because I think also they probably thought he was a god, or like Hercules or someone who Zeus was protecting, and there was no way they could defeat him. So that probably affected their morale. But there is, again, remember we talked about Orientalism when we talk about the West writes about the East, that sometimes Western writers can stereotype Eastern people and say they're exotic. They have long hair, they have dark skin, the men wear jewelry and are sort of gay or whatever, and they're fraidy cats, they run away. So we have to take it with a grain of salt. Maybe this didn't happen exactly like that. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean it all happened this way. We know there was an Alexander, we know he won these battles, but there's an expression that history is written by the victors. The people who won the war get to control the narrative and control the story of the war. So if the Nazis had won World War II, or if the communists had won the Cold War, Russia and China had won the Cold War, we'd be learning totally opposite of what we now learn. So that's something to be considered. Well, I know one thing I want to talk about. When they say what his greatest achievement was the way he treated Darius's family. So instead of killing Darius's family or making them slaves, he let Darius's wife keep all her gold and all her servants and even gave her more. So you're better off because I kicked your husband's ass, and your wives, your daughters, I'm going to arrange marriages to princes. This is what happens when you're defeated by Alexander. You're better off than you were before. And that's something that the United States has tried to emulate. So against both Germany and Japan, when we defeated them in World War II, and now they're our best friends. The Japanese are our best friends in Asia. The Germans are our best friends in the continent of Europe. So that was a kind of cool thing that Alexander did. And it shows that he wasn't just a brute conqueror. And I think this made a big influence on Plutarch, who's the last author we're going to talk about tonight, where the super important evaluation of Alexander, because in addition to what he actually did, there's a reputation, the cult of Alexander, the worship of Alexander. He was the model for the following people: Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, and any other big conqueror you could name. Really thought, oh, Alexander's the man. Like, he's the guy we really want to copy. Plutarch saw Alexander as a kind of philosopher in action. So I just thought we could question that, because it's one of those things, it's a nice phrase, and someone might quote that on the paper or something for school. But I encourage you guys to always drill down and go, sounds nice, but does it really make sense? So we just define philosophy as love of wisdom. So he was a great man who loved wisdom. So in that sense, you say maybe he was a great philosopher. He's saying he was a philosophical conqueror, but he was still a conqueror. So he had the values of a philosopher, and he valued philosophy, but he was clearly not an academic philosopher, and he wasn't a philosopher by trade. So we can admire Plutarch for making that comparison and for setting it up, because if you look at it, he devotes a couple paragraphs to making this argument. You know, Plato wrote about the perfect state, but no one paid any attention. And Alexander passed these laws and everyone paid attention. So I see where he's going, but ultimately I kind of agree with you guys. Let's see what else, anything else here. He brought everyone together. He got people to think of themselves as being part of one family. Let's go to this last paragraph, because I think it's actually quite beautiful. That's quite a beautiful and powerful passage where he uses the metaphor of the sun and says, look, some parts of the world that didn't have the good luck to get defeated by this guy are still dark. And I would just want to make a point that, you know what the Jewish yarmulke that the Jewish men put on, that is, scholars believe that represents the sun. Because when they were in Egypt, there was the sun god that was worshipped there, and there was this one crazy pharaoh that thought there was only one God, and it was the sun. And so Moses hung out with this pharaoh and got this idea of putting a little disc above you to remind yourself that the sun God is always above you. So it reminded me of that, where he says, we all look up at the same sun. But then there were some people who didn't look up to that sun. They didn't get to be part of that culture. That was too bad for them. Alexander brought Greece to the known world, from Italy to India, but not to Northern Europe and not down into Black Africa, right? So those parts were always kind of different. Germans never got conquered by Alexander, and they really never got conquered by Rome either. Some parts of them were under Rome for a while, but they fought back, and they actually were the only people to ever really defeat Rome. They never got conquered by Alexander. They never got conquered by Rome. And so there's this kind of narrow band of Europe which absorbed Greek and Roman values, and is, basically England took those values and took them over here to the United States. And that's all part of one culture, Western culture. Germany didn't really come into it until the year like 900. And so that's an important thing to understand. So on that, we kind of complete Greece. So beginning tomorrow, we move on to Rome. which is an interesting thing to study. A lot of cool architecture, cool engineering, and some really good writing, which we're going to get into tomorrow.